Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Henrik Werdelin joins us today from New York City. Henrik is a co-founder of BARK, a publicly traded company that supplies subscription boxes, toys, and other products to over 2 million dogs. Henrik is also the founding partner at Prehype, a venture development firm behind a number of notable successes, such as BARK, Roman, and Managed by Q. Henrik is also an author, having recently published The Acorn Method, How Companies Get Growing Again. Henrik, I've really been looking forward to this one. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about your childhood and experience growing up?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I guess grew up with a single mom. Well, my dad lived not too close from us, and so I got to hang out with both. And spent most of my childhood thinking that I wanted to be a journalist. And so I ended up kind of like doing endless amount of kind of like initiatives, from the school magazine to interactive CD-ROMs, which was like the craze back then. But Copenhagen, and then when I was about 20, I moved to London. And then when I was about, 30, I moved to New York City.
Got it. And do you recall when you first became interested in pets?
I mean, like we had a dog growing up. And so I think most people are in some way and form interested in pets. But, my first furry love was my first dog.
Would you say it was an abnormal relationship with your dog? Like, do you think you had a stronger relationship with your pet than most people? I'm just curious, where does this come from? I mean, we'll talk about BARK in a moment, but I'd be curious to hear where the infatuation came from.
No, I don't think it was. I mean, I think like a lot of other people, I like my dog a lot, and I like other dogs also. But like the special bond is really between my dog and myself. Not necessarily kind of like I always knew I wanted to do something with dogs. Mm-hmm. I ran product development for MTV Viacom and had done other startups before. And it was really only when I ran into my co-founders that this kind of like idea of making something for dogs materialized.
I'd be curious to hear more about that. So you met your co-founders. What ultimately led to the founding of BARK? Like, what did you guys notice, or talk about that process?
I mean, like a lot of the inspiration was my co-founder, Matt. He had a Great Dane living in New York City, and there just wasn't a lot of cool stuff for Hugo. And so it wasn't necessarily like a very thought through kind of plan. It was, hey, what about we make some cool stuff for Hugo? And Carly had just started Uber in New York City, and I had just come out of another startup, and Matt had come out of another startup. And so he, did Meetup back in the days. I did media back in the days. Carly kind of like was an operation logistics person. And so I guess we just approached this space with the experience that we had brought from our, past experience into this.
Got it. And BARK was formerly BARK Box, right? You started with subscription boxes. What was the first subscription box? What were the products that went into it?
It was, I made the first version on a WordPress template as just kind of like, hey, wouldn't it be cool to make like a box for dogs? And we started to show it to friends and went down to the dog park and showed it to people there. And when people said, hey, I'd like to sign up when it's ready, we responded, well, we have Square on our phones. Just give us your credit card right now and we'll take your money. And so I think the first box were just us having like 70 accounts and Carly running down to the local, pet shop and buying stuff. And then just us, putting it in a brown box and then shipping it out.
Awesome. Love it. Definitely a resourceful approach and something that doesn't scale. But when you reflect back to the beginning, what was that biggest challenge going 0 to 1?
I mean, I think had pretty good traction pretty early on. I mean, we had a concept that was easy to understand, and we are in a category that hadn't seen a lot of innovation for a very long time. And we came around in kind of 2011, 2012, when Facebook and Instagram kind of like started to really become like a bigger thing. We were in an industry where our product shows itself very well on Instagram. And so I don't think we had kind of like, here's the big challenge. I think we stumbled a little bit into something and was a little bit like, hey, wait a minute, there seemed to be a lot of opportunity in this space. and was a little bit blown away by how little innovation that the category have seen. Imagine in all other categories, you have like a defining leader. You have, I mentioned Uber for transportation, and you have Nike for running shoes, and you have all these different iconic brands. But when you think dog, which is huge, you didn't really have like that brand that people emotionally connected with. And so I think we got excited about this idea that we could build that.
So back in 2011, were you guys wondering why? I'm sure you were asking yourselves, why is this, right? Like, this is a space that has seen little innovation. There's not a category defining brand. What were you guys telling investors as to the why now back in 2011? Like, why was 2011 the right point to be launching a brand like BARK?
I mean, like, one of the things that first off, we kind of promised ourselves that we never would raise capital. I think all the three of us kind of comes from a school of thought, which is, let's just build a product where the CAC to LTV makes sense. And that kind of like old school approach was something that we basically in the early days, like, hey, maybe we can bootstrap this. And historically, we haven't raised that much capital. I think we raised about $50 million in total until we went public. And so we were never kind of like on the fundraising kind of like machine. It also was a category that was tough to fundraise for at the time because it was seen as kind of like a cutesy little kind of like, funny thing. And so we were lucky that we had all built companies before that had received capital and had a little bit of success, in our history. And so I think that made it easier. And then we had some really incredible investors that kind of were along with us throughout all the years.
Yeah, I know one of those investors, Trip Jones, who speaks very highly of you guys.
He's the best.
Yeah, he's great, especially when it comes to consumer. I mean, he's really got his ear to the ground. Yeah, I'm curious how you think about, like you mentioned that funding back then, perhaps for this type of brand was more challenging. When you think about just building a consumer brand such as BARK today, what do you think is more challenging from a timing perspective, to build a company such as BARK back in 2011, or do you think it's more challenging today?
I think it's a good question. I think maybe also what is relevant is to think of the market cycles, right? Like, I'm an old fart, so I remember 98, like I remember 08, and so I've been through, a few of these cycles where suddenly the market is incredibly hot for a few years, and then you get into a period of time where it's really incredibly difficult to fundraise. And we came just out of one of those cycles. And I think in many ways, I think that's relevant for people who are thinking about starting companies, is what business do you build at what point in the cycle? And how do you make sure that you align your fund cycle, kind of like our fundraising strategies, with the hype cycle and the product development cycle and all those different things? And so maybe to answer a little bit different to your question, I think one thing that we were lucky / sensible around was that we built a company that made sense for the period in time in the financial cycle we were at, which allowed us to kind of become robust enough to now, when we see another kind of that downturn, we're kind of like over that hump where we have a real business and we have gone public. So we have real capital and all those different things.
How are you guys navigating the current environment? I mean, the markets haven't been kind to public companies, BARK included. How have you guys been weathering the turbulent markets?
I mean, like, I think because that we've always been a sensible business, and because we always were keen to be able to operate a business even if financing was not available, it's always been kind of like part of our DNA. Like, we don't like have a fancy kind of like approach to most things. And I think we're kind of like keeping in tune with that to this point of like, obviously it's frustrating to see your stock price go down. And obviously it's frustrating for, when you think you're doing well, that you don't feel like that's getting noticed right away. But the market, I think, over, a period of time is a fair market. And so we're keeping our heads down. We're building good products at an affordable price. We're making dogs and their people happy. And we do that in a sensible way. And as long as we kind of stay true to those first principles, we expect to be a business that's going to be around for many years and can claim the crown of like being that defining dog brand that our kids will talk about.
Yeah. I actually wanted to talk about BARK's newest line, BARK Food, because it feels like a slight departure from toys and play, but I'm curious how you view it as an adjacent product line. And I'm also especially curious to hear you key in on competition, because I feel as if competition in the dog food space is seen as fierce. And I'm curious how you're thinking about differentiating bark food.
Yeah, I think we have always thought ourselves as being in the business of making dogs happy. And while that sounds very like aloof, that has always been kind of our guiding mission. And throughout the years, we have tried to stay very kind of focused on constantly trying to find ways where we, with the advantages we have, can build new ways for dogs to be happy. And sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't work. And so we started the process, pretty much from the beginning. We originally bought toys from external vendors, and then we started designing them ourselves. And we saw the product that we're delivering not as here's a cheaper toy, but here is an experience you can have with your dog every month. And so with us, you see the themes, and what it seems a little bit kind of like simple, it has quite a lot of like dimension to it. And so we probably do say 40, 50 new products every month. We're very kind of topical and relevant with our toys, which makes the owners think they're funny and they get excited about them. The toys themselves, we spend a great deal of time like figuring out what the best squeakers are and like what the form factor and what the fabric and anything to make the gameplay really fun. And when you take something that is very optimal for the dog and you layer a narrative and storytelling around it, the owner gets excited and the dog and the human kind of feeds off each other and create some of that. And so the way that we look at anything we do is how do we create not just a better food, how do we create a better experience? How do we, don't just think about feeding, but we think about mealtime. And so from a philosophical point of view, I think we are approaching the industry slightly different and more holistic than other of the people in the space. And I think from a practical point of view, we are the biggest kind of brand in D2C. And so what that gives us is the ability to ask customers every month, not just what should your dog eat, but what does your dog actually like to do and play with? And so I can give you quite detailed answer of what does a 3-year-old Labrador in the Texas region kind of like, how do they actually enjoy themselves? What is their play style? What are some of the different sensitivities? Do they have specific allergies and all that stuff? And taking that data and inputting it into our product development process is something that few others can do.
Yeah, that's a very interesting approach. And I have to imagine if you enjoy dogs and you enjoy product, BARK is probably the place to be working.
I mean, like it's very, very fulfilling to get pictures from your customers and it's furry dogs that are having a field time. And I think we've invented a lot of stuff. I'll give you an example of how we think about it as an experience. One of our most successful toys that's been on the front page of Reddit many times is Consuelo the cactus, which has a toy-in-toy, which is something that we kind of started to do. And so it's a toy, Consuelo, she's happy on the outside. And then you'll kind of tear her apart of the dog wool. And then she's sad on the inside because Consuelo is complicated. And that kind of like allowing you to extend the playtime and having kind of multiple moments where something new kind of happened, even something as simple as a dog toy, is something that I think makes us perform better than others.
Interesting. This is definitely going off script, but now you're just making me curious. What has been the biggest product flop? I mean, it seems like an incredibly data-driven company. You guys have your ear to the ground with customers, and a lot seems to be working. But what hasn't worked? Like, I would be curious to hear a story of a product that you launched that you had high expectations for, and it didn't go well. And what was the learning derived from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, like we do look at our business, the physical business, as we're building software. And so we are very fast to try something and see kind of like if it works. A long time ago, we made something called BARK Care, which were supposed to be kind of like a telemedicine kind of thing. And this is many years ago. And we were very excited about it. And it was both telemedicine, but it also was kind of vets on wheels. So if you were in New York or San Francisco and your dog was too like big to be taken to the subway, or just like, dogs get really scared when they go to the vet often, you could call us and we would have like a vet jump on a scooter and then kind of come to you. And there, we just, for the amount of investment it would take us, we couldn't get the unit economics to really work for us. And so we closed that down. Now, we still kept a lot of the learning, and like part of what that kind of like got us onto was BARK Bright, which is kind of our dental product, which is kind of like a monthly subscription where you mix a kind of a dental stick with some specific developed enzymes toothpaste that allow the dog to basically chew on this stuff, and the active ingredients and the enzymes will make your dog's mouth like more clean. So I don't think, as many thing is that if you see these things as failures, then you end up not trying to do stuff. If you see them as kind of risk-adjusted experiments, then I think you get a lot of good out of it. I got another one which might be cooler for actually, now that I thought about
Let's hear it.
In our office, we obviously have tons of dog toys and tons of dogs. And one day I noticed that every day I came in, there was like this specific dog that would come in, and it would go to like our pile of dog toys. And it wouldn't just take a dog toy. It was like it had like a specific thing that this dog wanted every day. Like, hey, wait a minute. Like maybe dogs have preferences. And wouldn't it be cool if dogs could do the shopping themselves? So we created a store in Manhattan where dogs would come in. We would give them a vest on with sensors, and we put RFIDs in all the dog toys in the store. And then the dogs can run around and just play with the toys themselves. And then the owner would get like a notification on their mobile phone of what is the toy that the dogs really want. What I learned was that the owner then, like looked at that data and then bought the toy they thought was the most funny. So like the dog didn't get to choose at all. But what happened after that was we got a lot of attention around that. And while that specific concept by itself didn't work, it really launched kind of adventures into retail. Target then had seen it. They called us and said, hey, these guys seem to want to do something really different in retail. And then we started like a long relationship with them based on like making that experiment that I guess didn't really seem to be a viable kind of long-term have our own stores kind of business.
Very interesting. How do you think about creation in general, and where does your inspiration come from? I mean, you mentioned this concept of idea flow to me, and I was curious if you could tell us more about what idea flow is. How do you ingrain it in the business to produce these products at such rapid pace?
I mean, like the word idea flow I've stolen from two people from Stanford University called Jeremy Otley and Perry Claiborne. And they wrote this book recently called Idea Flow. And the premise of it is really that you need to get a lot of ideas. And so that most people kind of get stuck when they get one, and then they kind of like run down to that. But often you should just wait a little bit and come up with more. At BARK, we kind of have built that into the business because we personalize a lot of the toys based on the play style. And so while you subscribe to a BARK box, what you're really getting is a box that's tailor-made for your dog. And for us to be able to do that in a scalable way, you have to kind of design towards like a matrix of, like what are the different, let's say some dogs don't like rope toys and some dogs are allergic to chicken. Then you need to be able to create a box that is still on theme, but that have those different properties. And so we are already in the habit of just kind of like churning out ideas all the time. And so that's something that you just build process around and kind of become good at. In terms of inspiration, it's pretty easy. We all have our dogs and we go and stare around them all the time. And one thing I always find is that while ideas might be difficult sometimes, problems are easy to get hold of. And so we try to kind of look around our world with our dogs and find sentences that starts with, it sucks that. And we say it sucks that a lot of times, then it's probably because that there's some opportunity to build a service or a product for it.
You talked about the process around creation, but what about the culture? Is there anything you do differently to empower people to fail, I guess, for a lack of a better way to put it? I'm sure putting idea after idea out and trying to find something that sticks, you have to have a culture with people that have thick skin, right? Like they need to be okay failing. They need to be empowered to make those decisions. Is there anything you guys do that's unique from that perspective?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. Like, the cultural elements are super important for that. And we definitely try to build that. I think we had the benefit that in the early days, everybody thought it was kind of a cute little funny business. And so we've always kind of like had the don't take yourself too serious kind of approach internally. A few examples to kind of like promote culture. A very immature cultural element that still is in office is that if you forget to log out of your computer, somebody will write "I love farts" and in the subject line and send it to the whole company. And then what will happen is that people will then start to discuss why this specific person might love farts. Now, it sounds a little bit immature, which it totally is, but if you still kind of encourage people to make it okay in a serious big company to make fun of farts, a few things will happen. First, for security, people will never forget to log out of their computers. I mean, like, it is the best IT security kind of like a method ever invented. And second, I think people are more relaxed when they come into a meeting and, like they've just kind of seen one of those stupid emails. It lightens the mood. And I think it gives people permission to go like, hey, this is a dumb idea, but what if blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. In our office, we have a toilet where there's 2 toilets in the same kind of stool. And it has no other effect than just having people go like, oh, this is weird. But if you've just been through the process of deciding if you want to use the left or the right toilet, or if you should have invited somebody, then I think you go back to your desk and you think about whatever you're doing in a little bit in a different way. And so we're definitely a company that really tried to, in a very purposeful way, try to create structures, designs, and kind of like breadcrumbs that empower and promote kind of like a different way of thinking.
Would you say developing those systems and processes has been more difficult than, scaling from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10? And you guys are definitely in the 10 to end stage now. And as you think about those 3 stages specifically, which has been the most challenging from your perspective?
I think a lot of that DNA is kind of made very early on. I see, you might be too young, but there was a movie called Revenge of the Nerds that was kind of big when I kind of grew up. And it was this kind of beautiful story of basically all the most nerdy, geeky people from college basically kind of winning. I think, along the way, a lot of us at BARK just felt that all these quirky people who wanted to take a job just to make dogs happy kind of suddenly kind of had momentum. And it was kind of beautiful that they could kind of be successful too. And what did that have created, I feel, is a place where being quirky is not frowned upon. It's something that's very much celebrated. And people, through serendipity and through kind of like the network of people that are working at BARK, I think attract more people like that. So I think, now these things kind of like get embedded, in the DNA of the organization pretty early on. And then it just builds from there.
So where do you see BARK going over the next 5 years? Like, how will BARK stay the same? How will it advance? Where are you taking the business?
I mean, like the vision stays the same. We want to make dogs and their people happy, and we want to be the defining brand for dogs. And that means that we will keep building products and services that make dogs happy. And so that gives us endless amount of run rate for, things that we can do. And we see ourselves pretty broad in that, aspects. Like I know my co-founder always like make the kind of like the statement, well, you shouldn't be too surprised if you suddenly start to see like a dog airline from us. But that is really how we think internally, is that for anybody who has a dog who listens to this podcast, they'll know that travel, for example, is really freaking annoying if you have a big dog. And so it sucks that, right? In the same way that when we built the dental product, we started with, it sucks that you have to brush the teeth of your dog, but you don't want to. And so in 5 years, we are in our continuous journey to build a company that cares a great deal about these furry animals. And hopefully we're having a good time doing it. And the reason why that's important is because that sparkle and that energy, needs to be embedded into the products that we make.
Are there any areas that you specifically are keying in on for short-term growth and or long-term growth?
I mean, like we've been very clear on us moving aggressively into things that dogs can eat. We're already a very big supplier of treats because we have millions of customers that are getting our box every month, and there are 2 treat bags and a chew in those boxes. And so we have quite a lot of experience in that field. And we have initiated our kind of move into kibble, breed-based kibble, and whole experience around how do you feed a Labrador as I have in the best way. And so you'll see more around that for us. But to the point, like, we're now in fun food, kind of home and health. And those are pretty full. Those are 4 pretty large categories that we'll just continue to build in.
Got it. And do angel invest right now at all?
I throw my random seat check
Is it mostly consumer businesses, or will you invest in anything?
I'll invest in anything where I feel there's a founder that has a idea of something that I also feel the world needs to kind of see. And so that ranges very, very far. I've invested in 3D printed space rockets to bio companies that are making plastic eating enzymes over to a company that make binders for people who are gender fluid. And so I fall in love with founders that have, sparkle in their eyes and have something that they really want the world to kind of like buy. And then I try to give both my money and my experience to them to see if I can help them be helpful.
What do you see early stage consumer founders most often getting wrong?
I think you have to realize that it takes a long time. And so you hear the stories of people who are around for a few years and then they sell, and those stories are there, but most don't. Like, they slog around for a long time. And so I think what they get wrong is that they don't make it clear for themselves who is the customer that they really want to serve. Like, who do you want to answer the phone from every Sunday for the next 10 years when you have other things that you also would like to do? And so having people who love dogs calling you every Sunday, figuratively, and answering them is something that is very meaningful. And I think sometimes people go like, oh, right now things are, crypto is exciting, so I should build something crypto. But there's customers on the other side of everything, and those are the ones that you should be passionate about serving.
Yeah. It sounds like having that intense connection, the truly authentic obsession with the problem is a key for you to writing an angel check.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, like, I like problems much better than ideas. If you have a founder that has a specific affinity group that they really care about, and they have a very clearly defined problem, then all the features and the products you throw at that problem are just thesis statements. And sometimes you might be wrong, and sometimes you might be right, and sometimes you might get the timing wrong, but your idea was right. But if you care about that user group and the problem is big enough, then you have the ability to kind of keep trying. Otherwise, if it's just idea and it doesn't work, you have to pivot or you have to close down.
Mm-hmm. One of the other challenges that you mentioned to me was the importance of building the right crew. So let's say, you have the right problem, you have a solution that's working, you need to scale. How have you advised founders on picking the right team around them? Like, have you learned anything on that front from your experience scaling BARK?
I mean, like, one of the most, I guess, not controversial, but counterintuitive kind of like thoughts that I have is that I really think about hiring people that I like. I want to hang with them, because you hang with them a lot in startup land, right? And it's endless. And there will be, a lot of different times when things are difficult and where you will have to have difficult conversations. But if there's good chemistry, then those conversations are much easier. So I used to make the joke that I'd rather hire somebody I like than somebody who's smart, which is not necessarily true. But I definitely think that chemistry, specifically in the early crew, is very important.
I'm curious to get your perspective on this. What do you think separates an A player from A+? And what percentage of people are truly A+?
I don't know what percent it is. I would align that question with what I think is entrepreneurial. And I think, as somebody who is built from 0 to 1 quite a bit and who likes that process a lot, I think I gravitate a little bit to people who have some of those characteristics. And for me, a good entrepreneurial person is somebody who is pretty well-rounded in their ability to do stuff. And so I think I tend to like people who have more than one specific skill, like somebody who can, move projects down the field, being, with a sense of resourcefulness. And that is often a little bit of a specific character. I do think that people who have a little bit of agitation are interesting. Somebody who have something to prove, something that kind of keeps up at night. They have urgency and agency. I find very attractive. I do find good storytellers to be important. So somebody who can craft the narrative, whatever they do, if it's a feature or a new financial model. And then also, and this is maybe a little bit more to the founder than necessarily staff, somebody who have a little bit of gravity, somebody who feels that a lot of people will kind of follow them. And I think that's important. very specifically when you're looking at founder, but I think even for early team members, because these early team members will end up become the leaders often in the organization. So one of the things that we don't talk enough about is how much we should celebrate the early staff members in the companies that become something, right? Because the founders get a lot of the kind of like the glory, but you have a first, second, third, and fourth hire.
Yeah.
And they are just incredibly important. And they take a lot of anxiety on their shoulder and a lot of risk too. And I think all of us was kind of like had a little bit of success with what we did, own a great deal of gratitude to them.
Who are some of the unspoken heroes of BARK? Like any of the employees that have really stood out?
There's many. So like, I think I mean, it's one of those when I start to mention people, there's 10 I don't. But like, give me an example of somebody who's been with us from the start. Like there's a woman called Stacy who I basically kind of like lured to come and join us by saying she should write our content. But she also kind of had a need to do the customer service and so much else. And so she's still in the organization, is still kind of like doing all our content or running the teams that do all that. But she was there like when we were just like a few people sitting around a table, right? And you don't hear a lot about that, but there's many people. And Becky was our first engineer, and like there's like a lot of people who kind of like have been part of that journey that you don't often kind of like hear about as often.
What do you miss most about those early days? Call it like sub 10 people. You're in some rundown office. What stands out in terms of what you really enjoyed about that time period and what you miss the most?
I mean, like for us, it was just a very good time because we were a lot of people who would like to hang out together, and we had early momentum. And so there was kind of good energy going on. I mean, like it's a little bit like getting older as an individual. I don't necessarily have some friends who go like, oh, don't you just miss being in college? And I mean, like, I like being in college, but I also really like my life now. And so I think I'm probably a little bit more of a person who really cherish the different moments in time for what they were, but don't necessarily want to go back and kind of like do that right now. I also really enjoy where we are now and trying to kind of bring a lot of the approach that we had back then and keep that in our organization.
Henrik, if we could feature anyone on the show, who should we interview and what topic would you like to hear them speak about?
That is a good question. Just because we talked about seat checks, and so that is kind of like what's present in my mind. There's a person called Kylo Freeman who built a product for gender fluid people, and they have really spent a great deal of time figuring out like how do you build like a new product for an emerging kind of like peer group. They're very, very fascinating. So like I think you'll enjoy having a conversation with Kylo. There's also this guy called Max who built this 3D printed rocket company. And I think what I have never really talked too much about him is he used to be in media. He built like a video platform, kind of blanking out what the name is, right? It's a big one that people will know. And he built like a camera, the Mevo camera, I think it was called. And then he completely pivoted and said, I think we should 3D printed rockets to send them into low orbit space. And he did that 8 years ago. And so the subject matter I thought would be interesting is like, how is it that we as entrepreneurs allow ourselves to go from something that is completely, from one side to another, where I think in established businesses, obviously somebody who worked in media would never get a job in a rocket company.
Yeah, it'd be difficult to think of two markets that are more apples and oranges. What's one thing that you'd like to see change about either the startup or venture ecosystem today?
I mean, like, I think we live in a time that's a little bit more kind of uncertain than I think we did 10 years ago. It feels a little bit more kind of like uncertain, and it seems that people are more anxious. And so I think having people be a little bit kinder to each other is probably something that I think would be beneficial. Building companies are incredibly difficult and super emotional. Everybody have, like some levels of mental health issue because like it's just uphill on the way. And there's this kind of, I feel, both very harsh and also overly celebratory kind of narratives running around. And the reality is that we're all just trying to make something cool for the world to see. And so maybe it's because of my Twitter feed of today, but I think a little bit of kindness would be good.
Yeah, Twitter feels like a dark place as of late. Henrik, what do you know that you need to get better at?
I think I created this thing I call the 8+1 framework, which is the ambition of trying to become not just good at one thing, but balance being, be a good dad and be a good friend and be good at my job and be a good investor and be good at understanding what my output is and figuring out better ways to scale that and be good at, my mind and my body and all that stuff. I think what I always aspire to is to become more efficient of balancing all those different things. So use experimentation to yield better outputs for my inputs across all those different vectors.
And Henrik, what is the best way for listeners to connect with you?
I have open door policy on LinkedIn. So for kind of one-to-one relationship, that's probably like the best way, but I'm on all social media channels. And so I'm sure that I'm very findable.
Awesome. Well, Henrik, this was a real pleasure. Best of luck navigating the current markets, and thanks again for the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Really enjoyed it.
You bet.
That will wrap up today's episode. Thanks for joining us here on the show. As always, show notes and links for the interview are at fullratchet.net. And until next time, remember to over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining us.